Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Levi-Faur, and I'm most happy to host in this webinar on theories of regulation and governance. I'm very, very happy to host the editors, the guest editors, the contributors to a special issue of the Journal of European Public Policy. The special issue is on the regulatory security state in Europe. The two editors are with us, Andreas Kruck and Moritz Weiss, and also some of the contributors. I am kind of a commentator myself in this special issue on the regulatory security state. I was very, very happy to see it coming. I didn't know about the idea in the four stages of the idea, but since I have interest in the regulatory state and the way it develops and goes to different direction, I thought that the regulatory security state is an excellent idea for special issue and also agenda for research. I did myself something on a regulatory welfare state, so it goes in the same, I think, in the same directions. I will give the ability to talk to Moritz. Is in front of you on the right end of the screen. I will put myself aside, and Moritz, you move first. Thank you very much, Moritz.
Thank you very much, David, for the opportunity to present our research here. Now I shared the slide. Does it work?
Yeah, it works perfectly.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. Thanks a lot to Philipp and Ingvild who have also joined us. What I want to show you is, or what we will argue in the next couple of minutes, is that providing European security really involves the EU as what we call in this special issue a regulatory security state. And that implies, first of all, two things. First of all, rules have become prevalent in policymaking, and second, that political decisions increasingly rely on technocratic experts. So let's start with a few observations on European security, and begin with some of the traditional defense matters, or core state powers, one could say, such as arms production. Yes, it's still the realm of sovereign member states, but the EU has in fact made a difference to that domain. So since 2010, a number of EU regulations have encouraged private investments into military innovation. The Commission has pushed forward rules that has clearly reduced the uncertainty among rule takers that are defense firms. And that is very nicely shown by Kaya Schilde in our special issue. At the same time, the EU has also taken some still hesitant step towards expenditures. And for example, it has established the European Defense Fund with a very nice study in our special issue by Katrin Höffler. And when we continue and move forward more to this digital security, as we call it, the EU plays a key role in the development of using artificial intelligence by military actors. For instance, we will see in a couple of minutes with Ingvild that it draws on global experts, mostly from the corporate world, to set technical AI standards. What the EU has also done, it has set up expert agencies. For instance, ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, which meanwhile serves as a kind of epistemic authority for EU member states to address some of those challenges from cyberspace. And here we have a very nice study by Max Metz and Miriam Dant-Caverty. So in a nutshell, the EU is increasingly involved in European security. And what most of the contributions highlight in the special issue is that, first of all, the EU's approach to security looks very familiar to what we know from EU politics more broadly, namely developing policy impact by setting rules. And second, EU institutions focus on reducing uncertainty and on relying on expertise rather than distributive bargaining or majoritarian politics. So taking one step back, that sounds very much to what regulation scholars have argued with regards to the EU's governance of the single market and other issue areas. And therefore, we have raised the following research question. How can we conceptualize these transformations? So who governs European security, by what means, and how is it legitimized? And we argue that the regulatory security state allows us to capture these transformations. And to better understand what constitutes the EU as a regulatory security state, let me start with the more traditional notion of providing security in European studies, international relations, and I'd say political science more broadly, and that is the sovereign, the positive security state. Here, government is a monopolist of political authority. It draws on state capacities, such as armed forces, police, and the mode of governance is one of top-down command and control. The foundation of its authority is political in the sense that the government is in the rightful position to protect the community. So the idea is that governments can make security relevant decisions because they have reached this position in accordance with some accepted procedures, in our case, most of the time, democratic elections. So by contrast, what would this look like in a regulatory security state? First of all, who governs security? And we argue that a security state is not necessarily a sovereign nation state, but any polity that makes collectively binding decisions to provide security in a certain sector. So important, it's a sectoral perspective. That can be the government, but it can also be an international organization. And there we draw on David Lake's notion of relational authority, which arises from an exchange between a governor and the governed. The governor provides order, and the governed in turn accept to be controlled. As a result, then, authority needs not to be monopolized, but different actors may order different fields or sectors of security. And in Philipp's world and words, authority is managed rather than monopolized. Second, then, by what means is security provided? Rather than only drawing on state capacities, such a governor may also draw on the more indirect form of rules-based governance. And this includes legislative, bureaucratic, judicial rulemaking. Think, for instance, of the 5G regulations. Protection against a potential Chinese threat is not provided by a military unit, but rules are set with which telecommunication providers need to comply with. In short, security guaranteed by rules. Third, how is the authority of these different governors legitimized? And rather than political procedures such as elections, the source of authority may also draw on expertise and the recognized claim that experts are most competent to provide security. So those in power can make security relevant decisions on the grounds that their policies outperform alternatives. In short, they are more efficient. So to sum our concept up, a regulatory state is one in which experts shape security decisions, which privilege rules, and these decisions are justified on the basis of performance. So please let me conclude with some of the main findings of our special issue, which should show how pervasive the regulatory security state has become. Because we find it very prominently in digital security, where state capacities have traditionally been scarce. But it has also established itself in the field of individual security, like in health or also with respect to human rights. And perhaps surprisingly, it even extends also to military security, where it normally combines rules-based and capacity-based governance. However, the special issue also points to the ambivalences of the EU as a regulatory security state. The effects are not always the desired ones. So it has unintended negative consequences for the effectiveness and the legitimacy of security policymaking in Europe and beyond, something that we will certainly discuss in this webinar as well. To conclude, precisely because its implications are so consequential but ambivalent, we think that the regulatory security state deserves further scrutiny. We are happy to do so in the future, Andreas and me, and in particular in times now when member states and the EU are struggling to muster the capacities for a strong response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With this, I would like to conclude. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and the Q&A later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moritz. We'll stop there. And I think, Andreas, shall we bring you or Philipp or Ingvild first?
Ingvild will go next.
Okay. Please, Ingvild.
Right, thank you.
You have PowerPoint as well.
Yes,
surprising.
I just have a mini one.
Much.
Yeah.
But please increase it. Increase the size. Thank you.
Can you see it? Is
yeah,
that
see
appropriate?
But you can also increase the screen, so full screen.
Okay, I had the impression that this was full screen already, but okay, hang on.
No, we see the slide.
Like this? Is that better?
This is excellent. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's roll with that. Thank you so much. So thank you for this opportunity to present a research I conducted jointly with Hendrik Hults. So our article really investigates the emerging regulatory security state through examining how the EU aims to regulate military AI or military applications of AI. And what we see here, kind of just initially to set the scene, is a very ambivalent position that the EU takes in between regulating and promoting AI technologies. So on the one hand, of course, we all know that the EU sees itself as a rule maker on AI, as evidenced by the draft AI Act. But then on the other hand, if you look at that act, it explicitly excludes military applications of AI. So which makes kind of the EU actually a reluctant governor of military AI. And I will talk a bit more about how we explore this in the piece on the next 2 slides. So really, to make sense of the EU's approach to regulation in the field of military AI, we study how it is informed by epistemic authority. So that for us, of course, is a core concept in the context of the regulatory security state, but also really for us. And we're kind of unpacking in our research this concept in studying how the EU precisely constructs expertise-based foundations of authority in terms of its approach to governing military AI. And we posit that the EU actually plays here an ambivalent position of both the rule maker and the role taker of military AI. And both of these, to some extent, build on designating technical corporate experts as the kind of the key experts to advise the EU on military AI matters. So I think there's quite a selective construction of who is the right or the appropriate expert going on to advise the EU. So let me go through these arguments in a bit more detail. In terms of the rulemaking, the EU constructs epistemic authority by creating expert bodies, such as the Global Tech Panel and also the high-level expert group on AI. So, which kind of means that, and this is of course something that is not unique to AI at all, but it's very much an evidence here, so that you have these technical corporate experts who become invited contributors to the EU's rulemaking initiatives through the front door. An article studies in particular the Global Tech Panel in terms of its composition and the practices that it engages in, which was created in 2018, especially to provide advice to the EU on the use of AI in the defense sector. And there are many kind of statements by EU officials that very clearly say that they believe the members of this Global Tech Panel are the ones who have the right expertise to advise the EU on these matters. But if we study the composition of the Global Tech Panel, it becomes quite clear that what kind of expertise is valued here, which is actually mostly associated with the technical corporate world. So for the GTP has 14 members in total, and most of them are former or current representatives of tech and financial companies. Among them are individuals who represent or were affiliated with major tech companies, such as Google and Microsoft. We kind of argue that in kind of drawing on these particular types of expertise, the EU basically buys into a dominant corporate framing of AI technologies as a highly technical field that necessitates technical solutions, right? So it's quite notable that the experts actually are really only these technical corporate experts and not, for example, more kind of ethical or political aligned experts. So then designating these particular types of expertise as most relevant to the detriment of others, the EU potentially risks regulatory capture by industry without even making capture necessary in a way, because these are invited experts rather than this being the result of lobbying. And then we also posit the second argument that the EU actually also, or EU member states in this instance, actually also become rule takers of military AI. And this kind of follows insights from science and technology studies in arguing that the ways in which these technical corporate experts design the functional applications that become part of military AI in the first place, that already these applications contain by and of themselves certain rules that will then govern applications that EU member states use. So this kind of goes with the assumption that we should not only look at rules as something that is kind of deliberately fashioned by policymakers, maybe using the advice by these technical corporate experts, but they also are embedded into the very design of these military applications of AI. So we basically then look at kind of the practices of these technologically designing these military applications of AI performed by companies both in the EU and in the US. So for example, on the EU side, we kind of look at how major European defense companies have made particular design choices that kind of limit the exercise of human control over the use of force. And then we also see this very much playing out in terms of the US manufactured systems that then EU member states end up using. It's kind of interesting because, of course, the US and the EU have rather different regulatory positions on military AI as kind of posited in deliberative forums. But we can think that basically through kind of using these often US designed applications, EU member states might end up kind of accepting de facto, right, regulatory standpoints that are kind of in contrast with the deliberative standpoints. Right, to conclude, because I know I'm running out of time, we are kind of coming to the conclusion that we very much see the EU's regulatory approach to military AI as informed by epistemic rather than by political authority. And kind of looking at this case can really tell us something interesting about how epistemic authority in this context is constructed. But we also find that the field of military AI does not really match an ideal typical taxonomy of the regulatory security state. So we actually see elements of both the positive security state and the regulatory security state in here. And we also identify like a move maybe towards more hybrid and fluid forms of authority. So where we see an increased blending of kind of scientific technical competence, corporate interests, and also formal political authority guided by the knowledge production of private actors in both informal and informal settings. And we also just want to make the point again, as I just highlighted, that when we think about where rules come from, we should look not only at the deliberate process of rule setting that at the current core of the regulatory security state, but when we talk about these digital technologies, we should also think about the technological encoding of rules and how this might affect the kind of rules that the EU might adopt in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingvild, and we'll invite Philipp to present.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. You can also increase them. Excellent. Thank
okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to this special issue. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this webinar. What I did in the joint paper with Markus Jachtenfuchs in the special issue was really to comment on the framework paper by Andreas and Moritz in light of the contributions that it inspired. And, you know, the key question was whether and when is the regulatory security state an alternative to the positive security state. Now, of course, these two concepts are ideal types. There's no expectation that any real world state will ever be only positive or only regulatory, and Ingvild has just explained that. But you know, in order to understand the ideal types, right, it's important to zoom in into their core features. And there's two. One is the mode or the means of governing regulation and, in the regulatory security state, and state agency, state capacity in the positive state, and the mode of legitimation, the mode of authority, political authority in the positive state, and regulatory epistemic authority in the regulatory state. Okay, on the means or the modes of security provision. Here the idea is the positive state provides security directly through state agencies, while the regulatory security state provides security indirectly through regulated non-state agents. And what we say is that the relation between the two is really unbalanced, because regulation, to be effective, depends on capacity. So if you want non-state agents to do your bidding, you need the requisite capacity to incentivize and enforce their compliance with the rules you set. So you cannot enforce rules without the capacity to enforce them. Oh, now what happened? Can you still see the?
No, now again, yes.
Yeah.
But you have to increase.
Now again, you know, it
Excellent.
was all the excitement about presenting, I guess. Okay, so the positive state can stand on its own feet, so you can enforce security without rules, but you cannot rule without force. Or as we put it, paraphrasing David, you can't steer without a minimum capacity to row. Second, on types of authority. So the idea is that the positive security state depends on political authority. So the accountability of the government, the threat of losing its job when it does the job not properly. While the regulatory security state depends on expertise-based authority, the presumption that the experts, the technocrats, know better what to do than the lay persons. Now, the problem is, of course, that epistemic authority, that expertise, is often contested and is not failure proof. So epistemic authority works fine if the reputation of the experts is not contested and if everything works well. But if the experts fail, if something, if a political project fails, the responsibility will fall back on political authority. So again, political authority is viable without epistemic authority, but not the other way around. Of course, it is often the case that states rely on epistemic authority, and Ingvild just had the case of AI, and the reason why you invite Google and Microsoft and experts from other US firms is not only because they know better what European security requires, but because you simply lack the capacity to do it on your own. So you rely on the epistemic community for lack of better alternatives rather than because you believe it's such a great thing. So for both reasons, for the dependence of epistemic authority on political authority, and for the dependence of regulations on enforcement capacity, we would say that the regulatory security state cannot stand on its own feet, but depends on the positive security state. But of course, as I said in the beginning, there are mixtures. Sometimes rules are more or less prevalent. That depends on sectors. Now, if you talk about the positive security state, the focus is usually on protection from violent attack. It's about military security, it's about territorial integrity, it's about protection from organized violence. When it comes to the regulatory security state, it's often on protection from non-violent attack. It's about human security. You mentioned cyber security. It's about the logistics of security, so arms production. It's about things like AI. It's about even health regulation in one of your chapters. And of course, these are very different areas of security with very different requirements for governance. And, you know, quite intuitively, both the positive and the regulatory state are more appropriate for some threats than for others. So the salience of military threats compared to human security varies across time and space. So in the golden years after the end of the Cold War, military threats were comparatively low in Europe, which allowed really a focus on rules and epistemic authority in the area of security. But, you know, military threats are back with a vengeance. So the main reaction to the war in Ukraine in both NATO and the EU is not, let's have more rules, but it's about, let's build more state capacity in arms production and in military capabilities. So here I stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Let's remove the, yeah, and I think, Andreas, it's my turn, right, Moritz? Yeah, so I'll add spotlight and bring you all inside. So I will not be the only contributor on the screen, and I'm not going to use slides, but say a few things about the project and how I see it going forward. So I told you that I'm very happy with the project. I was very happy to hear and to be part of it, and this is one reason it is because it puts the state in the center again. So the thinking about the state, theory of the state, was a major issue in the literature when I was starting my career, but it's less so in the last decades. So the theory of the state, and the theory of the state is the kind of from a regulatory point of view, or bringing the regulatory state into the welfare state, security state, democratic state, and so on. So regulation is very, very important to all sides of the state, welfare, democracy, and there are dozens of labels for the states, and in all of them, regulation is very important. Now, the debate is really, what is this regulatory state? It's a new state or an old one? And my argument in my commentary was, the regulatory state is really old as the state. And what we are witnessing is new forms or new silences of regulation, a new way to do regulation. And you can see it in different fields and different regions of the world in different ways. And also an argument about the regulatory state that I made in the commentary, but also before, was that what we are seeing is not a regulatory state replacing the positive state. And this is more a Mayone kind of understanding of the regulatory state. The regulatory state is really expanding, not necessarily with connection to the contraction or the expansion of the positive state or the security state, etc. The regulatory state is here to stay because we are living in a world of more complex, this is functionalist view, but all world of more rules or more interest or more legitimacy to different interests that will create their own rule spheres. And those rule spheres are together are making the regulatory state, but they are not a part, they are not necessarily only indirect, they are also direct. And they are part of the expansion of the state more generally. So Mayone was wrong to predict the decline of the positive state as a welfare state, but also as a military state. We are still there, as Philipp correctly could pinpoint. We still need a positive state. But the regulatory state can be very, very positive. It can be liberal, it can be illiberal. But even when it's liberal and when it's illiberal, it's expanding. Deregulation agenda and so on. It's not more than it's more than just a rhetoric, but it's a weak rhetoric. Let's say it's in most arena you see more regulation. Now security. I'm not an expert of security, but what I suggested in my own contribution is that we can think about the security also from the perspective of the risk state. So it's a risk paradigm on the way politics is being institutionalized. So think about security as part of the risk arenas or the risk state. I'm much influenced by a work by David Moss from Harvard Business School, who in 2002 wrote a book called When All Else Fails, and he is kind of creating a theory of the state which builds from social security and goes until accidents and work safety and so on, showing the expansion of the American state. But this American perspective can be taken to other to other countries and regions. So thinking about all those issues and looking at biosafety, for example, or risks from ecological risk and so on is part of the agenda. And I think what we're seeing and what is being identified by Moritz and Andreas can be valid there as well. And I also recommend not to think about the security as a issue of defense narrowly, but more as a kind of risk management of everything. Okay, so we have audit expansion of everything, but we have also risk management of everything. And we are very good in trying to do that, less good in really implementing that. So risk state, the regulatory state is a positive state, and coming back to the idea of the state and what is the state. I will conclude by one argument, one observation that came up to me actually in this talk, is that the debate is not anymore about the role of the Europe vis-a-vis the member state, but they are going together. This issue of conflict around the relative division of labor is in a way became less prominent. It's still there, but less prominent than it used to be. So observation to continue the discussion. Thank you again for inviting me, and I will now take my role as a moderator, or actually give to Andreas and Moritz the ability to moderate. Please. Moritz, Andreas.
Thank you very much, David. I think the natural thing to do would, first of all, thank all the contributors for their great input. Thank you very much. And even more so, thank everyone for showing up and showing the interest in participating in this webinar and showing all the patience of listening to 4 presentations. And now I think it's up to you for the audience in this Zoom room to ask your questions, make your comments. And I think the 5 of us actually will be very happy to hear your comments and questions. And probably, David, I would suggest we collect questions and comments and then perhaps do a final round amongst the 4 or 5 of us.
Excellent. You steer. I will roll.
Perfect. So who has a question or comment to make?
So we have Bertold and Henry. So let's start with Bertold and then Henry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this great project and for the very interesting presentations. I've just discussed some of the aspects you had mentioned and discussed in the special issue in class. And one student asked, well, there's so much that is now securitized and that you link to the regulatory security state. Can you specify what actually is not part of the regulatory security state? So, you know, the issues that you raise, they pertain to a very broad range of policies that we might or we might not associate with security issues or risks. So maybe you can highlight that a bit. Unfortunately, the student's not here, but I promised I will relay your answer to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertold. Henry, I think, was next.
Yes. Hi. Thanks for that. I have to confess, I haven't read the papers, but I was interested in this set of talks because I've become interested in ideas of regulation and security and sort of expectations of the state to protect, a sort of the sort of fundamental premise of the social contract. You know, the state will protect you if you cede your liberties, a certain degree of liberties up to the state. But I'm slightly, I suppose I just want a bit of clarification about what you mean by the regulatory security state. And do you mean that kind of we're seeing the expansion of regulation into new domains of, you know, production, state activities, private activities of security, which weren't previously regulated? So we're seeing the kind of routinization, institutionalization of particular rules. Is that domain also expanding from kind of just basic production to the monopoly of violence? Or do you mean by the regulatory security state a new norm of regulation? The kind of the norm that underpins security sounds rather unqualified. This is about providing absolute protection. And are there distinctive norms that kind of underpin how much security regulation is providing? And is this what's distinctive about the regulatory security state? It's a new norm of regulation that has its own philosophical underpinnings.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments from the audience? Those were great interventions, I think. I don't see none. I don't see anyone for the moment. Should we just start with the first round of responses, and maybe a couple of comments and questions will then show up as a follow-up. And first of all, allow me, if I may start in the order of the presentations again, perhaps allow me a short response to Philipp's intervention and also David's points in his presentation. I think what stands out, and I think that to some extent also addresses what Bertolt and Henry asked, we clearly understand the regulatory security state and the positive security state as ideal types, right? In the real world, in the EU, in nation states, we don't see pure positive security states, pure regulatory security states. In the real world, we always see mixes in policy instruments and in foundations of authority. However, we argue we can fruitfully ask what kind of instrument, what kind of foundation of authority is predominant, is prevailing at a particular point in time in a particular sector, and how is the relative importance of rules versus capacities, of epistemic versus political authority, how is the relative importance of those components evolving over time in a certain sector. So that is, I think, the more accurate understanding. And then I think the question is indeed what kind of mix, real ideal, what kind of real mix do we see in a particular sector in a particular point in time? And to address another point that Philipp made, I think a couple of the points that you made, we don't disagree that much with you, actually, when you argue about capacity being necessary for effective regulation. Yeah, probably that is true. Probably you need some amount of capacity for effective regulation. I would say you also need some amount of regulation in order to be effective in governing by capacity. I can rarely imagine the fully autarkic state that doesn't rely on third-party support and thereby regulation. And similar, I would say you need quite a bit of political authority to stabilize epistemic authority usually. But I would also say usually it's the other way around. Political authority usually also needs epistemic authority, at least as a supplement for stable, recognized, authoritative rule. And actually, I think you often do equate the state or regulation with the effective state or effective regulation, right? We need capacity to be able to conduct effective regulation after all. Maybe this is so, but there's a lot of statehood and a lot of regulation out there in the world that is not effective, that is non-effective, and it's still statehood, and it's still governance, and it's still regulation. So, and at that point, I think we should also clarify that other than perhaps Mayone a couple of decades ago, we do not presume that the regulatory security state is necessarily an effective or legitimate way of providing security. I think we have ample and several contributions to the special issue that raise big doubts about that, about the ability of regulation to provide effective security. I think Ingvild's and Henrik's contribution stand out there. Contribution by Timo Seidel and Anke Obendig, and also the contribution by Anna Leander in the special issue raise big doubts about that. So I think if we don't presuppose statehood and regulation to be effective, I think there's well possible that we have a state that primarily relies on rules and primarily relies on epistemic authority. I have to quicken up a little bit. Does it depend on the issue area, whether we see PSS or RSS types of security states? I think we would agree, and Moritz presented at the very beginning, that we see a concentration of rules and epistemic authority in the digital sector. But I think the special issue shows, Kaya Schilde's nice contribution, the contribution by Catherine Höfler shows that even in the military security field, we see at least in a particular sector, an increasing relevance of rules-based instruments over time. Has Ukraine killed as the Ukraine war, the war against Ukraine killed the notion of a regulatory security state. I think that was the final point Philipp made. I don't think so. I think a lot of the struggles that the EU and the member states in Europe have in terms of building capacity right now have to do with an institutionalization of a regulatory security states for decades. And I think we see quite a bit of rules-based indirect reactions to the Russian invasion in terms of governments trying to incentivize firms to ramp up production, rules-based sanctions regimes, think of SWIFT and stuff like that. So I think it's fair that there are challenges to the RSS, and it also goes to what Bertolt said. I think what is not part of the RSS. We wouldn't claim the RSS is everywhere, and we wouldn't say everything is security, but we do start out from a notion of security that includes both physical integrity, but also safeguarding people's, collective entities' ability to act as independent and purposive entities. So it includes both protection against bodily harm and the ability to act in self-determined ways, and to protect polities against direct violent threats. And you may say this is a very broad notion of security, and it is, but I think this allows us to show exactly the differentiated presence of the regulatory security state in different domains. Classical military versus individual human security. And Henry, very briefly, I think, is it an expansion? I think it's primarily an expansion of regulation into new domains. I think that's the key move that we observe here. Regulation as an instrument is moving into new domains. And then you were asking, is there a new norm of regulation emerging here? And that is a very, very interesting follow-up question, and I wish I had a very good answer to that. I find it very intriguing. And I think there are two stories to tell about that. First, is there a regulation norm right now that regulation is the default mode of governing emerging, and this norm has even extended to security? Maybe not so sure, but as Philipp indicated, there's quite a bit of resistance against this notion that regulation is the standard mode of governing in this field of security. I think a lot of people would still say it's appropriate to respond to security threats with capacity, with different state responsibilities. So I'm not sure there is a norm of regulation in that sense. In other fields of security, individual security, digital security, I think there is a better case to make that regulation is the norm, the model to use in terms of government instruments. The question is, to what extent the norm of regulation, what is appropriate regulation, is different in security as opposed to other fields of regulation. And I think the answer is, and Moritz also pointed out to this, and that brings us back to closer to Philipp's point, actually. The closer we move to military security, direct military security, the more the norm for regulation is to combine regulation with capacity-based coercive means of the state, right? In that sense, we see in this field of military security quite a bit of combination of regulation and capacities, but I think that doesn't, as David said, mean there is no regulatory security state. I'll stop it at that point, and I think Ingvild would be next to address questions and comments raised.
Thank you so much for these questions. I would just like to say something quickly about Bertolt's question. So what is not part of the RSS? I think that's a fascinating question, because I think in the space of technology, although our contribution was specifically about military applications of AI, of course, the whole space of AI is completely being securitized, So you hear a lot about the AI race, right? And it's not just about arms, right? It is about the technology itself. And I think we can see that happening not just in terms of AI, but all kinds of technologies, be it bio, everything from hardware to software, 5G, the infrastructure, right? So there's this whole kind of disruptive technological space, all of which is now being securitized, I think, and quite heavily also by the EU. So I think it's we might see an ever greater expansion, actually, of what can be capturable by the RSS, which I think is quite worrying, because it gives a certain different sense of what kind of regulation is necessary or not. And I just want to respond to one of Philipp's comments about the lack of capacity, because I think it's quite interesting. You know, I completely agree. So, of course, political authority turns to epistemic authority because it lacks the capacity to deal with these kind of questions. But then it also becomes interesting to see who do they turn to. You know, so there's a potentially different groups of experts that they could turn to, but they turn to a particular group of experts, these kind of technical experts, which kind of suggest that they think AI, for example, right, or these technologies in a broad sense. So what is at stake here are kind of technical problems that require technical solutions, right? But then, of course, if we think broadly about what is the relevance of AI in our broader societies or security, it's actually not a technical problem that requires the technical solution. These are kind of deeply normative, distributive issues, you know, that are at stake. And by kind of focusing on a particular type of expert, that also has an effect on visions of regulation, right? So I'm sure that many of you will have heard about these open letters that were signed by kind of prominent AI CEOs like Sam Altman, who then subsequently went on a European tour, meeting with European leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, right, being prominently photographed as kind of issuing these warning calls, right? But then, of course, that Sam Altman has a particular vision, right, of regulation. And framed around this kind of existential threat that AI supposedly pose. And I'm not saying that there is not an existential threat potentially to AI, but usually these kind of visions fall short on the kind of more short-term risks, right? That would also maybe necessitate a complete reevaluation of the current business models of these tech companies that are not actually then in the focus of what could be or should be regulated. So I think it's I think kind of who is your expert kind of then means that you are also accepting a kind of regulatory vision into your fold. Yeah.
Thank you, Ingvild. Philipp.
Yeah, thank you. I realized that after 3 years of talking back and forth in the production of this special issue, there isn't much disagreement left. I think on a conceptual level, David really summarized it nicely by saying that the regulatory security state is not a replacement of the positive security state, but part of an expansion of the state in general. I think that's what most of us have in mind. A second argument by David, I found a bit surprising. So he said, you know, this debate about EU versus member state, that's really passé.
No, I didn't say so.
Well, but you know, it has lost in salience. And, you know, that might be true, but I think it depends a lot on the means of governing. So I think it has decreased in importance in the regulatory field, but I think when it comes to capacity, it's still very present, who foots the bill and who benefits. So I think in this field, it's still very present. On Andreas in his response said, oh, you know, Marcus and I, we always look at effective states or assume effectiveness, while in fact states rarely are fully effective. And again, I don't disagree with that, but it's a bit tricky to defend your theoretical ideal types by arguments referring to bad reality. You know, I think the ideal types are types of effective states. They model how states can be effective. And then an empirical finding is, of course, neither model is ever fully implemented and effective. But the argument, the finding that the model is never as effective as in theory doesn't protect you from theoretical arguments. final point on Ukraine. Yes, of course, there have been rule-based reactions. You know, the anti-sanctions regime is rule-based. The entire energy transition, energy savings stuff is regulatory. And also, you know, the EU tries to ramp up its intervention in arms production, not very successfully so. But wouldn't you say that the beef really is in all these pledges? You know, Germany, we have 100 billion special fund for the modernization of our armed forces. And I think 21 of the 27 member states significantly increased their military spending since February last year. And that's about capacity and not about rules so much.
Oh.
Thank you, Philipp. As much as I would want to react, I will hold myself back very tightly and give David the opportunity to respond and also conclude, I think, the webinar, if I'm not
Thank you,
mistaken,
Andreas,
David.
for holding yourself back. I will say a few things that I hope to keep it clear. So capacity. We have fiscal capacity and we have regulatory capacity. Capacities are in all spheres, are around all instruments of governance or in policy instruments. So we need capacity in both and the force coercion appears in both the rules and in say fiscal capacity. It plays a role. But it never been the only source of power. It was also, we have normative sources, dominance, ideational aspects that are coming together with force to create those capacities or those orders that we are speaking about, meaning the regulatory security state. So it seems what I hear from Philipp again and again, and also from Marcus, is that capacity seems to be basically about fiscal and about coercion. And I'm not forgetting about that. I just think that they are both there. So the real order is always hybrid. It's always about both steering and rowing, because you cannot, doesn't make sense to row without steering or to steer without rowing. You have to have them both. And this hybrid, this hybrid is really the way to think about ideal types and so on. Which type of different hybrids are coming into play? So maybe this is some of the issues that we need to discuss in the future. Regarding how we understand politics and governance more generally. Thank you very much all for the opportunity to be here. Do you want to conclude, Moritz, Andreas?
I couldn't say more than just thank you. Thank you, David, for not only contributing to the special issue, but also hosting us here, giving us the opportunity to present and discuss. I think it was interesting, at least for us, I hope. I hope it was interesting for those of you who joined. Thanks for joining, and hope to see you at another occasion, perhaps even in real life.
Excellent. I will just add, thank you very much to the editors of JEPP, Bertold Rittberger and Jeremy Richardson, dear friends who gave us all the opportunity to be published and be heard. Thank you very much all.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.